All right, everybody, welcome back. Congratulations on completing another section and another section exam. We are moving right along from organismal biology to looking at molecular and cellular biology. So previously, we were really looking at the classification that biologists use to understand and differentiate types of life. And now what we're going to be doing is really zooming in and understanding the biological and chemical processes that make up different organisms. So your chapter book this in your book this week frames this in a really interesting way, in looking at how biologists and scientists are starting to think about how we discover life on a different planet, and really what specific things we have to look for in order to be able to classify something as living or non-living. So our driving questions for this section are going to be just that: is like how is matter organized into molecules of living organisms? What is the definition of life, and how could Martian life be recognized? What is the basic structural unit of life? And lastly, why is water so important for life and living organisms? So, when we start to think about characterizing life, biologists have framed living organisms to have these five functional traits. First one being growth, second one being reproduction, next a term called homeostasis, sense and response to stimuli, and then the ability to obtain and use energy. So for an organism to be considered living, it has to include all five of these traits in order to be considered a functional living organism. So I want to spend some time going into each of these five traits and thinking more specifically about what they mean. So the first is growth, which is just the process of increasing in size. And so when we think about unicellular organisms, we think about just sort of this increase that cells go through before reproduction. And we're going to be talking more specifically about the cell cycles in later lectures. And then for multicellular organisms, growth just refers to an increase in the organism's size as a number of cells making up these organisms increases. Again, we're starting to think about things in terms of a cellular level. So keep that in mind as we move through these next few lectures. The next trait is reproduction, so just the process of producing new organisms. So sometimes these are asexual processes where you're getting specifically identical offspring, but more often than not, we're talking about reproduction of offspring into new organisms that don't have the same genetic structure. And again, we're going to be talking more specifically about cellular reproduction and how that works in later lectures. Next, we have this term homeostasis, and that's just essentially meaning the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. So while the external environment outside of an organism might change, the internal organization and maintenance of the host remains essentially the same. So an example of that in humans would be our body temperatures. For the most part, it remains relatively stable despite how cold or how hot it is outside. So again, what this is really referring to is this ability of an organism to maintain some sort of internal structure, even though external stimuli may be completely different than the internal environment. The next thing that's critical is not only that our organisms sort of have this homeostasis signature, but they're also able to respond to the environment. So they're able to sense and respond to different stimuli. And this is the process of reacting to their environment. So it's not only being able to maintain something of the self in a changing environment, but also then starting to react to that environment. So an example of this is like a lot of those trophisms that we discussed in our previous lecture, looking at plants, where, for example, phototrophism uh, of the plant starting to react to light in order to obtain and create uh, and respond with photosynthesis. And lastly, we have this ability to obtain and use energy. So it's allowing an organism to do work. So all organisms have the ability to take in some sort of energy, either sunlight or nutrients, and then use that energy to create proteins or basically sustain the chemical reactions that are necessary for an animal to, or for not necessarily an animal, but for an organism to maintain maintain homeostasis. An example here could be photosynthesis and how plants are able to convert sunlight into energy that the plant then uses for growth. Again, all of these tend to be are interconnected to one another. So it's good to sort of think of these things in terms of, okay, I need to I I need to be able to react and respond to stimuli. A reason why I might do that is to obtain energy. So my ability to obtain energy, that ability to obtain energy is helping me maintain the chemical reactions that allow me to stay in homeostasis and ultimately allow me to grow and then reproduce. So again, these are highly related to one another, but it's important that each of them have a very specific function for a living organism. Now, when we're thinking about energy, we're thinking about energy that is either coming from sunlight or some sort of food. And then organisms are able to break down that energy or to break down that food and then use it for the reactions that are necessary to sustain life. And when we're talking about this in a biological context, we call this metabolism, which is the sum of all chemical reactions that are occurring in living things. Um, so it has a slightly different definition than what you might have used metabolism colloquially. But here we're really talking about the chemical reactions that are occurring in living things. And what we're going to do, and we're going to pick up in our next lecture, is understanding the chemical reactions that are critical for life. So we're going to pick up there for our next lecture. See you soon.